All right. So the first chapter in this section is dedicated to line, shape, and contrast. So let's begin with line. Lines are the most fundamental element of art. Every artist uses lines in just about every work of art or design that they create. Lines really organize the visible world, and they can be used in a variety of ways. Lines can be used to define a work's shape. So, for example, this is an ancient design, one of many that is known as the Nazca lines. They exist on the high desert plains of Peru. And this one is in the shape of a spider, but there are several others that are rather mysterious or unusual. So notice here that the lines define the shape of, in this case, the spider. So these were created by scraping off the top layer of dark colored gravel from this landscape to reveal a bright white gypsum stone that lies just beneath the surface. So in a way, these lines are sort of incised or engraved, kind of carved into the topmost layer of the earth. Um, and so these are very large. This spider is about 150 feet long. And so these aren't like most drawings. They can't be picked up and carried away or folded up and stored for later. Um, in fact, these Nazca lines were only first discovered in modern times by overflying commercial aircraft. So they are quite mysterious. We don't really know why such huge designs would have been made, especially on ground level. What was their purpose? What was their sort of symbolic meaning? We don't know for sure. Some scholars have suggested that perhaps these were images dedicated to the gods. Other scholars argue that these images are meant to point people toward wells or water sources within the desert. But regardless, it's impressive that these ancient peoples were able to use lines in such a definitive way like this. Here we have an example of line being used to connect different elements within a work of art. So this is the artist Chihora Shiota, and this is the work 600 Yarn Tied Shoes. So these are really lines that are more three-dimensional. We've got shoes that have been sort of affixed to the side of the structure here, and they all are attached with this red line or this red yarn um, to the same point at the top of the structure, the same sort of apex point. Um, Maybe that connects all of these individual shoes to the same source. Maybe that excuse me, maybe that creates a sense of unity or harmony, or maybe even it implies a certain sense of direction, like all of these shoes are kind of falling from above, but they're still attached, almost like bungee jumping shoes. Now, lines can be regular or irregular. So, regular lines are lines that are sort of basic. They are straight or they have constant curves. So, this artist, Barbara Hepworth, she is an artist who loves to use regular lines. And so, this work is actually a two-dimensional preliminary drawing that she created in preparation for a sculpture. So we've got straight lines, but we also have kind of constantly curved lines here. Notice that these are very mathematically precise, very sort of meticulous and accurate. Um, and probably in Barbara Hepworth's case, done with a ruler and a compass. However, these are not just basic, boring lines to her. She says that she rarely draws what she sees, but rather she draws what she feels in her body. And so these lines are not without feeling. They are still sort of expressive of her own individual experiences and emotions and things like that. Here's another artist who likes to use regular lines. This is Sol LeWitt, who's a minimalist artist. And so here we've got all straight lines, although he's kind of arranging them in different orientations, vertical, horizontal, diagonal, and then incorporating different colors. But regular lines tend to connote a sense of control, of rationality, or maybe of planning. But we can also have regular lines that sort of defy a sense of rationality. Here we have a work by the artist Mel Bochner, in which we have regular lines. However, they are quite chaotic in organization. We have these very sharp diagonals and lots of overlaps. And notice too that the quality of the lines is different throughout. And so the quality of a line, by that I mean how thick it is, or maybe how solid it is, excuse me. So notice we have these really bold black lines that kind of jump out at us. And then we have these softer, almost smudgy yellow lines that kind of fade into the background. This is based on the line quality, but also based on the materials that were used to create these lines. So notice here we have charcoal, Conte crayon, and pastel. All three of these are drawing materials that can be used in various ways. Conte crayon is slightly greasier than charcoal or pastel. Those two are pretty dry, kind of powdery. But anyway, we'll talk about the materials a bit more in our second section. But in terms of regular lines here, despite the constant, straight quality of these lines, we still have this sense of sort of chaos. Now, irregular lines are exactly what they sound like. They are the opposite of regular lines. They are those that are not straight, or their curves are not constant. So this is by the artist Andre Masson. He was a surrealist artist. The surrealists were interested in kind of exploring the subconscious, or maybe the depths of the human psyche, trying to free their creative imaginations. And so one of the ways they did that was through a process called automatic drawing, sort of just allowing your mind to take over and do the drawing, not making any real conscious decisions in what you're drawing or how you're doing it, but just letting go and kind of allowing creativity and imagination and kind of chance to create the work of art. And so that's what he's done here. And so we have these very sort of loose, spontaneous, unstructured shapes being created by these very irregular lines. They kind of weave and kind of flow around in different directions. They're different thicknesses. And so generally, irregular lines kind of convey maybe a sense of freedom and spontaneity, instead of control and rationality. Here we have a work that uses irregular lines, perhaps in a bit more of a controlled, rational way. This is Georgiana Houghton's Glory Be to God from 1864. And just looking at this with all of the different lines and all of the different colors, it may seem sort of chaotic and unpredictable. I mean, it is very irregular and very loose, but there is sort of a certain sense of maybe rhythm because of the repetition of colors and the repetition of lines, how they kind of echo one another in each of these sections throughout. And so to the artist here, she says that she has systematically ordered her lines and her shapes and things according to spiritual forces. She interprets her spiritual experiences and tries to create a visual representation of those experiences. So that's what's happening here. Now we can also have different kinds of lines, in that we can have contour lines or we can have outlines. So an outline is something that defines a two-dimensional shape, kind of the exterior boundary of a two-dimensional shape. It's silhouette or just the exterior edge. However, a contour line defines the boundaries that we perceive of three-dimensional forms. So contour lines are the lines that we draw to kind of record those implied boundaries. So for example, we have two contour drawings here that are depicting a nude female figure. And so these are contour drawings because they include exterior lines and interior lines for details. So we have lines that kind of define the exterior boundary of the figure, but in reality, a person's arm is not outlined. You know, we don't actually see a line, we just kind of perceive that that's where their arm stops. But we also have these kind of smaller interior lines between those boundary lines that imply details. They imply, well, in this case, kind of the dip of the bend of the knee on the back here, or maybe the curve of the hip, the shoulder blade. We've got just some lines that kind of define the curves and wrinkles of the knees and the feet. Just a little bit of lines to kind of imply hair, just kind of scribbling here. So contour lines include, or contour drawings, excuse me, will include both exterior and interior lines. Generally, contour drawings are rather economical. They just sort of provide the basic information. So again, here you can sort of tell that this is a female form, but we don't have, you know, an incredible amount of detail. There's nothing individualizing about this particular figure. It could be any woman rather than a specific one. Here we have a contour drawing that's maybe a little bit more complex. This artist, Egon Schiele, this is a contour drawing that he's done of his wife. And so, again, more complex, but still very economical. It's only putting in the necessary information, just using lines to sort of give us just enough information to convey the idea. We don't have a lot of shading or anything to kind of make her look like a real human being. There's no effort to hide the fact that this is simply a drawing. But he's used lines to define the exterior boundary of, well, her shirt and then of her hand. But then he's also used interior lines to kind of define the pattern and even some of the texture of the dress that she's wearing. All of these vertical lines are meant to convey that she's wearing a fabric with vertical stripes, but none of the lines are regular. None of them are truly straight. They're kind of sketchy and squiggly, which is meant to kind of imply that her fabric, her clothing is wrinkled. It's not perfectly flat, right? And then here with her hair, we have sort of softer curved lines, and they are again irregular to sort of imply that she has curly hair and that she's gathered it up in this big bun on top of her head. And then we can also have actual or implied lines. So actual lines are those that are clearly seen. They are made by a continuous, uninterrupted mark between 2 points. Implied lines, on the other hand, are simply illusions. They give the impression of a line without there being any continuous mark. They're not actually drawn, but just suggested based on the positions of various other elements in a work. So for example, in this illustration, you can consider a dotted line a perfect example of an implied line. Or on the bottom here, we have these electric poles lined up. And so they get smaller as we go along here, right? This one is smaller than this one. And so based on the position of the top of each of these little lines, we kind of create this implied line that runs diagonally through here, yes? So here we have a work. This is an illuminated or an illustrated manuscript page that was created in about the 13th or 14th century. But this has both actual and implied lines. Just looking at it, it may seem like it only has actual lines. However, if we zoom in just a little bit, we can see that actual lines, actual kind of continuous marks between different points, are used to create the text in the center of the page. However, the border and kind of the illustrations around that text is made up of implied lines because they're not continuous marks between points. Rather, we have letters and words that have been used to kind of create the implication of a continuous line here. Here, this photograph is a great example of implied lines. As you kind of look down this path, we get the idea that we have kind of two diagonal lines, one on either side here, but there aren't really. We just have kind of that implication based on the connections between these trees and the edges of the path, right? So lines can also be directional. They can seem to possess a certain direction, or maybe they can seem to direct your eyes in a certain way. And again, this can be an actual line or an implied line that suggests direction. But artists use directional lines to kind of move our attention to a certain point in the artwork, or maybe just to simply keep us looking at the picture as a whole and kind of noticing all aspects of it. So, for example, here we have an artwork titled The Great Wave Off of Kanagawa by the artist Katsushika Hokusai. So we have Mount Fuji in the background here. We have these boats that are being sort of tossed in this wild ocean wave. You can see the people kind of hunkering down on the boats here. How has the artist used directional lines here? Well, notice that with these waves, we do have sort of an outline here, right? But we have kind of this implication even without that outline because of the shape of the wave. It sort of seems to fall downward, crashing, and then kind of curl back upward and over to create the wave here. So in a way, it becomes almost experiential to view this work. You kind of ride the waves right alongside these boats and these figures as you view, because the implied directional lines move you around the painting, or actually the print in this case. But here's another example, perhaps a better example. This is Francisco Goya's 3rd of May, 1808. And so here the artist is portraying the execution of Spanish rebels by the French army of Napoleon. So the artist, Francisco Goya, he's sort of using various elements and principles to create implied lines or to create directional lines that move our eye across this work. So first, we can pick out a directional line that is implied by the edge of the hill here. We can sort of follow that down and around, taking in the background of this painting. We have sort of this church in the background, kind of obscured by shadows. Then we can sort of follow on around, maybe using the body of this figure here to bring our eyes downward. And then notice how the feet of the figures all line up here, again, creating this implied line that maybe directs our eye down and across. And then here we have another that runs up through this arm of this individual lying on the ground, up through the leg of the figure standing behind him. Notice how they're both diagonal and they both sort of line up there. So that carries our eye back up through, and then we could maybe use the edge of this shadowy figure here to direct us back up. And so we've made a complete circle using these implied directional lines. He then holds our attention on the focal point, or the main area that he wants us to look at here, by adding in these additional lines with the gun barrels that are pointing right at this central figure here. He uses some other elements aside from line to kind of draw our attention to certain areas. For example, notice that the background here is very shadowy and kind of dark, but then here in the middle where we have our kind of martyr figure, it's very bright and light. So he's using different values, which we'll talk about value again a bit later, but he's using dark versus light to kind of create a sense of contrast, which again, we'll come back to that as well. But using contrast between the darkness and then the light to kind of draw our attention to this man as well. But in terms of line, we have implied directional lines that kind of move our eyes all the way around. And then we have these ones, these implied directional lines with the guns that kind of point to the main focus of the artwork as well. Here we have another great example. This is Theodore Géricault's Raft of the Medusa. So let me tell you the context of this painting, and then you can kind of look and see if you can pick out any implied directional lines while I'm doing that. So this work it was painted in 1819, but it's referencing an event that happened in 1816. So a French merchant vessel was traveling from France to the north coast of Africa, to what was then the colonial, well, what is now Senegal, but at the time it was under colonial French control. Anyway, this merchant vessel was traveling to Senegal, and they ran aground and there was a shipwreck. Now, the wealthy captain of this vessel was a newly appointed captain. He really wasn't qualified to be the captain of the ship. However, he was friends with the new monarchy of France, and so it got him the job. Well, when the ship crashes, he takes all of the lifeboats for himself and his officers, and he leaves 152 people on a makeshift raft. 13 days later, 15 survivors were rescued from this raft, and the only way that they had been able to survive was to resort to cannibalism. So, looking at this work of art, did you pick out any implied lines? We were in class together, we could kind of talk about that. But instead, let me point them out for you if you haven't picked them out already. So we have one implied line that kind of begins in the bottom left corner. And so see this diagonal kind of leg of the figure here. If you follow that up and across, it kind of crosses over this figure, but then, sorry, but then picks up with the arms of these figures, again, kind of along that same diagonal implied line there. And we can continue to follow it up, 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 and it sort of curves maybe just a little bit and peaks with this particular figure right here on the top of the pile. So this is a figure that the artist has chosen to make the hero of this painting. He wasn't anyone famous or anyone, well-known and important. He was just a French Senegalese man who happened to be on this ship. But he's taken off his shirt, he's sort of waving it over his head, and then the guy in front of him is also waving this fabric. But what are they doing? Everyone's pointing that direction, everyone's waving that direction. We've got this implied line that kind of pulls us that direction. But what's going on? Well, if you notice, way back here on the horizon line, there's this little kind of shadow that's actually another ship. And so these figures have seen that ship and they're kind of waving their clothing, trying to get its attention, hoping that they will be saved. So by following this diagonal implied line, this kind of directional line there, we are led to maybe this idea of salvation or of hope. However, we also have another directional line that begins in the bottom right corner. Again, we can kind of follow the diagonal of this figure's body up and then across a couple of these figures, but then it picks back up in the leaning mast of the ship here. And so you follow it along up through the sail, and instead of leading to salvation or to hope, as the other one does, this one leads us to this giant wave that is peaking just beyond the raft here, sort of implying that the danger is not completely gone. These people are still sort of in a fight for their lives. They could be saved by this ship in the distance, or they could be overtaken by this wave and kind of overpowered by nature. One last kind of thing that I would point out here in terms of implied or directional lines, notice the ropes that are attached to the mast on either side. Those would be actual lines, correct? And so they create kind of these strong diagonals and sort of maybe a triangular shape if we connect those two diagonals. And so the triangle shape helps to stabilize this very chaotic composition. We have a lot of figures and a lot of activity. It's very sort of busy. But by using this triangle, it kind of organizes all of that chaos so that it is not overwhelming for the viewer. Now, lines can communicate direction, but they can also communicate particular feelings or maybe ideas. So, for example, vertical lines tend to communicate strength, authority, stability, maybe even height or verticality. Horizontal lines suggest calmness, peace, passivity, also stability, though, I would say. And then diagonal lines tend to communicate instability, motion, energy, or maybe drama and tension. And so if you think about diagonal lines being indicative of drama, tension, instability, motion, I think that becomes kind of evident in this work as well. But let's look at a couple of others. So this is Thomas Eakins' Bigland Brothers Racing. So what lines do you see here? We've got maybe strong horizontal lines with the boat here, but then that is sort of countered with the slight diagonal of the oar that this man is using. The diagonal maybe implies motion or energy. So we have this implication that the boat just being sort of propelled through the water, moving across. Maybe diagonals in the way that their backs are sort of leaned as well. Diagonals in the clouds, and then another strong horizontal in kind of the shoreline or the horizon line atop the trees there. Here's another example. This image is in your book. This is a page from a manga that has lots of diagonal lines within the designs, kind of used to show the explosion, kind of implying tension, danger, motion, and energy, but then also using diagonal lines to kind of separate these two scenes and maybe imply that one happens after the other, kind of moving from scene to scene. And then we have this example. This is the Nike logo, of course. Everyone is familiar with this. It's a very economical use of line. And so it also incorporates this idea of how a line can be communicative. We have this kind of diagonal check mark or swoosh. Maybe that evokes activity or kind of energy, motion. For me, it kind of makes me think about checking off something on maybe a to-do list, which, just get it done or just do it. That seems to go with the company logo and motto there. So if lines are the most fundamental element, shapes are the most clearly seen elements that are used in art. So shapes are two-dimensional. They are defined by height and width, but they do not have depth. Their boundaries are defined by lines generally, or they can be suggested, by changes in color or maybe changes in value, things like that. But using a clear shape helps the artist kind of communicate quickly and easily whatever they're trying to communicate. So again, Solowitz's wall drawing number 681C here. These are regular lines, however, they're also geometric shapes. Geometric shapes are made out of regular lines and constant curves. They are mathematically regular and precise. And so here, the shapes, these kind of rectangular shapes that are defined by the regular lines, we've got vertical, horizontal, and diagonal, still sort of implying precision, control, rationality. These works are interesting though, because if a museum or a gallery owns or displays a work by Sol LeWitt, they don't own a physical drawing or a physical object. They own a set of instructions that the museum staff uses to create this work of art. So the artist writes these instructions, and then the staff follows them to create and install the work of art. And the artist intentionally makes some of the instructions somewhat ambiguous, or leaves it so that the staff has to make some of their own decisions. And so that way the work has a unique appearance each time that it's reproduced. Okay, so we also have organic shapes. Organic shapes are irregular, they are unpredictable, and oftentimes they are suggestive of the natural world, because that irregularity sort of reflects the shapes that are found in living organic things. So we could return to the Nazca line drawing of the spider. This is definitely an organic shape. We have very irregular lines being used to kind of create the shape of a living organic thing. Oh, here are some other examples of these Nazca lines. So we had the spider, but we also have other animals like the monkey and birds. But then this one, maybe a small figure. But then there are some that are also just more abstracted. So here we have a tradition that uses organic shapes. These are the Maori people of New Zealand. And so these people have some of the most elaborate tattooing traditions. So facial tattooing for the Maori, it's called tā moko. And it uses primarily organic shapes. Now, the earliest known preserved tattooed bodies date to about 3300 BCE. And those tattoo designs also feature these kind of organic abstract designs with dot and line patterns. And so these Maori designs are part of this tradition. And so on the left, I've included an illustration that kind of demonstrates traditional men's Maori tattoos. On the right, I have a photo that demonstrates women's tattoos. But as you can see, they include these kind of organic shapes made out of irregular or organic lines as well. Just like we can have actual and implied lines, we can also have actual and implied shapes. So here with the AT&T logo, When you create a shape like this piece of blue here, that is a positive shape. It is an actual shape because it's actually there, right? But notice if we take two of those actual or positive shapes and kind of place them together like this, we then create an implied or a negative shape between the two of them because our eye sort of reads this as a continuous implied line, right? And so the entire blue circle is an implied shape because it's not really there. The blue strips are really there. Those are actual positive shapes. And then the white spaces between, those would be negative shapes or implied shapes. And this is something that graphic designers and illustrators use quite often in their works. So here is a little collection of graphic designs that incorporate different positive and negative shapes. And then here is a pretty common example. We see the FedEx logo. I mean, it probably depends. I mean, some of us see it daily, maybe. But have you ever noticed that we have this little negative shape in the text there? This arrow created by the empty space between the positive shapes of the E and the X there. It's interesting, right? We've included in our design this arrow that kind of implies the idea behind our company, FedEx, always going, always delivering. The arrow kind of implying going forward. It's interesting. And it's interesting that they managed to incorporate that implied arrow regardless of the language that their logo is written in. And here's one more example. This is a work by M.C. Escher. And so this artist really paid a lot of attention to the interplay between negative and positive spaces or shapes. So here we have a negative shape that changes from white in the upper half to black in the lower half. So we have this quite detailed duck in black at the top, and then this quite detailed fish in white at the bottom. But then as we kind of move towards the middle, they sort of transition, and the duck becomes less detailed as we go down until it's just a sort of negative black shape. The fish becomes less detailed as it goes up until it's just a white negative shape. And so we have this transition. This is something called figure ground reversal. The reversal of the relationship between the figure, which in this case would be the fish, and the ground or the black. And then up top, the figure is the duck, and the ground or the kind of background is the white. And so when one becomes the other, that is figure ground reversal. Okay, now let's talk about contrast. So line and shape are both elements of art. Contrast is a principle. Contrast is a way of combining elements to stress the difference between them. So you need two or more elements that are noticeably different or in noticeably different states in order to create contrast. So for example, in this illustration, we have a dark value of blue, and then we have sort of a lighter value of blue, and they contrast with one another. Here we have an example. This artwork is by an artist, Shepard Fairey. He was a street artist. And so street artists, their work, obviously, are going to be on the street. And so they need to be able to kind of quickly catch the attention of anybody who is passing by. If you're walking down the sidewalk, you maybe aren't really paying attention to the things that are on the street beside you. You're focused on getting to your destination. So the artist, a street artist, needs something that is going to reach out and grab the passerby and cause them to pay attention. So Here in Ferry's work, Obey, he has used contrasting organic and geometric shapes and contrast between positive and negative shapes or spaces to grab attention. So we have the negative white space and the positive black space or shape. We also have these kind of regular geometric shapes contrasted with these very irregular or organic shapes. And so those are being used to create the face of Andre the Giant, a famous pro wrestler in the 80s. And then he's also incorporating colors here for additional contrast. Black and white, those are the two kind of most opposites colors. And so they complement and intensify one another. And black and white are actually the most sort of basic colors. They're the first colors that a baby can see. And so that's going to sort of be accessible to any and everyone who walks by. But then he goes a little further and incorporates this very vivid red that contrasts with both the black and the white. And then the sort of cryptic slogan, Obey, again created with negative shapes, kind of makes the passerby stop and think, obey what or obey who? So it grabs your attention and kind of piques your interest just enough that you want to learn more. Here's another great example of contrast. This artist is Miriam Shapiro, and the work is titled Baby Blocks. So it's named after a traditional quilting pattern, which is this geometric pattern kind of in the background here. That is titled Baby Blocks, and so that's what she's named this entire work. But where do you see contrast here? Well, we've got contrast in the yellow and the blue. Yellow and blue are sort of complementary colors, so we'll talk more about that later, but they again complement and intensify one another. But then we've also got a contrast between the regular geometric shapes, these cubes, and then these very irregular organic shapes in the sort of superimposed flowers and dresses that she has added on top. We could also probably pull out more contrast in the colors. So contrast between colors, between patterns, between organic and geometric shapes. All right, this is the last work I want to look up with you today. And this is going to be sort of an application of the terms that we just learned about. So we're going to look at this work and think about it in terms of line, shape, and contrast. So the artist is Artemisia Gentileschi. She's a female artist active in Italy in the 17th century. And so this work is titled Judith Beheading Holofernes. So the story of Judith comes from, well, it's not included in the canonical Christian Bible, but it was written around the same time. Judith, it was a pious and beautiful young widow from the Jewish city of Bethula. And her city was under attack by the Assyrian army led by the general Holofernes. And so Judith was so moved by the plight of her people and by her faith in God that she entered the camp of the besieging Assyrian army, and she met the general Holofernes. He was so struck by her beauty that he invited her back to his tent for dinner and some wine, and he planned on seducing her. However, according to the story, Holofernes was so enchanted with Judith that he drank far more wine than he had ever drunk on any day in his life. And so he passes out, and Judith seizes the opportunity and beheads him, ultimately saving her people from this army. So this painting, in terms of line, shape, and contrast, well, lines are being used to define the shape of the three figures here. This is Judith in gold. This is her sort of maid servant or attendant, helping her. And then this, of course, is Holofernes having his head cut off. So we have lines being sort of implied by the change in color or the change in value to define the outline of the shapes here. We've got lines again implied with the change of value or color to sort of imply the details of the figures. But we've also got directional lines or communicative lines here as well. So notice that we have diagonals kind of in the arms of Judith, also maybe in the arms of the maidservant and Holofernes, and in his legs or just his body position in general. All of these diagonal lines imply what? They imply movement, energy, tension, drama. I would say that they are certainly kind of underscoring those emotions or ideas in this particular painting. This is a very dramatic moment. But they also serve to lead our eye toward the middle of the painting, which is in this case the focal point, kind of that main point of action, right where Holofernes is having his head sliced off. We could also read maybe the sword as an implied vertical line. Vertical lines imply stability, strength. So maybe the vertical of the sword kind of implies the strength of these women to overcome this man. And then we also have contrast being created by values. So we've got the very dark kind of shadowy background here, but then notice that the three figures are much lighter. They are almost like spotlighted. And so it seems that they are emerging out of this cloud of darkness into the spotlight here. And again, that draws our attention to the main kind of action or to the main focal point, kind of keeping our attention on the figures rather than asking us to, you know, go exploring in the background. So Gentileschi uses implied lines, directional lines, and high contrast values to sort of draw a viewer's attention to the central point of action and communicate this idea of drama and tension within this very violent narrative. So we will come back to this painting several times throughout the semester. But for now, we will leave it at that and move on from here.